Okay, my name is Rachael Woody. I'm here with Bob Morus. We're at Phelps Creek Vineyards, and it's June 11th. And my first question for you, Bob, is why wine?
Oh, well, I thought it started just kind of as a dream as to what would be a beautiful life to balance my professional career. So I thought that if I could live on a small vineyard of maybe 5 acres of land and 3 acres of vine and have a house in the wine country, that would balance my career as an airline pilot. So that's how it all kind of started.
An airline pilot, that's sort of an interesting way to parallel with the wine industry. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Well, I mean, the nice advantage of an airline pilot is that you can travel around the world. So you get to see a lot of different places. And you also don't necessarily have to live where your base is, where you work. So you can live almost any place. When I was hired, I was looking to get back to the West Coast where I grew up. And I had grown up in the San Francisco area, near, in a county that now has some vines, but at the time we'd go up to Napa and Sonoma even for Boy Scout camping trips. And so I was familiar with that area, and I was also, it was in the early 60s, Robert Mondavi's story about opening his winery and facility and all that was in the newspaper, and as a little kid I still read a lot. And so that captured my interest. So when I got hired, I was hired in Chicago, and I started looking at how could I get back to the West Coast. So I thought about going back to California, but it wasn't really an option with my carrier. Portland was a new base that was expanding. And so then I just changed my focus, and I said, okay, if I'm going to live this dream and have a house on a vineyard in the wine country and not be too far from work, what's a reasonable distance from the airport, and is there wine out there? In my research, I was able to find a book, and the book was probably written in the early 80s. This was now 85, 86, and the book talked about the Willamette Valley and the Columbia Gorge as far as grapes in Oregon. And I think if that book had been written 5 years later, it would have ignored the gorge, because the Willamette Valley then was a few dozen wineries, and out here it was 4 or 5 wineries. And so there was some balance. But within a few years, the Willamette Valley took off, and it would have just overshadowed what has been there ever since and has been growing out here. So I took a scientific approach. I drew a 90-mile circle around the Portland airport and said, where are vineyards and wineries in that circle? And that book provided me that answer. So we thought we'd go down to the Willamette Valley, look around, and come out to the Columbia Gorge and look for that perfect place. And because I had the image, like a lot of people do from outside Oregon, about how wet Oregon is, and I had picked up that to the east was drier, my first venture was to come to the Columbia Gorge, thinking it would be drier. Later on, I learned exactly where I am is the same rainfall as the North Dundee Hills. But at the time, that was the motivation. So we came in for a vacation, my wife and I, and decided to take a look around, and we actually got kind of lost. We came around 26 around Mount Hood and came down Highway 35 to the Hood River Valley, and as I'm driving down, I thought, this is really beautiful. It was a day like today with the blue skies, the mountains showing, and the cherries were just getting ready. And it was so nice that when we got into town, we just started to do some investigation, and we actually went to a realtor and said, what is land going for? And this one agent showed us a couple of different places that were, one was next to Hood River Vineyards. So Hood River Vineyards existed then. Right. And then the other one was this property that we're on right now. I think she only really showed us 2 places. And this place had this crazy road, as you saw when you came today, and but it had a spectacular view of the valley. I didn't know it had a nice view of Mount Hood. that at that day, it was kind of overcast and Mount Hood was obscured by clouds, but we could see the view of the valley, and we could see that we had this steep slopes, and some of the slopes went to the east and some went to the south, and that was part of what was supposed to be good for vineyards, as far as I knew. It was supposed to be steep slopes heading to the south. So I became interested. Then we went to the we did a little more investigation, but we ended up going to the Willamette Valley and looking around there. This was 1989, 1990. Went to the Willamette Valley and went to several wineries there, ended up in McMinnville, which we thought was a charming town. And so now it was kind of between Hood River and McMinnville. But I stayed around for a few more days after sending my family back home. And I took some additional time off, and I came back here and talked with county planning, talked with all these different people that you would have to in order to find out about whether you could build on a piece of property. And they were very cooperative. And I found this property by myself that day, and it wasn't easy, but I found the place, and I came out, and now it was a clear day, and I walked out into the grass to about where we are right now, and I turned around, and there was the mountain. And then I go, well, oh, okay, this is really quite a spectacular site. And the price was comparable to a house lot in Chicago where we were coming from, so for 60 acres. So suddenly I was into I was serious about a lot more land than I had planned on. I was originally trying to go for 5 acres and a little vineyard, and now I had potentially, if I acquired it, 60 acres, and I saw where I could plant right off the bat about 10 acres of grapes. So the dream just kind of, takes one step after another, and you find yourself a little bit deeper into it. So there was no house here. There was about here where the winery was, there was a double wide trailer, which is why we were able to build. Because it had grandfathered rights to build. And Oregon has tight restrictions on doing things in what's called secondary lands or in farm zones. So it's why Oregon continues to look like Oregon is, at the time it was a 40-acre minimum. Well, this was a 60-acre piece of property, but even if you had that 60, you couldn't build without the grandfathered rights. Otherwise, you'd have to put in a vineyard or put in a Christmas tree farm or whatever people put in to justify the income, the revenue source that you could then get a house put on it. But this place was ready to go because it had an existing trailer. It was able to build. So we continued to go down that path as far as acquiring this place. And then just shortly after, I started putting in vines. Now, I reached out to, coming into the community, grapes definitely were not dominant. This valley is an agricultural valley, long known for its pears and its apples. And so that's that. And at the time, pears and apples were dominant, and timber was another third, and outdoor sports, especially windsurfing, was an emerging economy here. And wine was, well, there was a few wineries. And so it didn't take long before stopping at Bill's Three Rivers and stopping at the Blanchette's and Hood River Vineyards that I was put in touch with people that were able to help me out even further. So one of the people originally was Lonnie Wright. And Lonnie was considered a grape group. A lot of other guys were known for having little wineries, but Lonnie was known for managing a lot of grapes. And so I met with Lonnie and brought Lonnie out here on the property, and we kicked some dirt, and he said, yeah, I think grapes can grow here, but what do you want to grow? And I wanted to grow Pinot Noir because that was all the press that I was reading. And that's about how depth the study was. I didn't bring in any consultants that checked the soil. I brought in a grape guy that wasn't really growing any Pinot at the time because he was growing mostly things 20 miles to the east where it took different varietals. But I knew Hood River Vineyards had some Chardonnay and they had a little block of Pinot, and those were cool weather grapes and their wines were pretty nice. And Bill across the river had cool weather grapes. So I was encouraged, and Celilo Vineyards had Chardonnay. And so because of all that, then I thought we would be okay with the cool weather varietals. I had at least enough sense at that time that I realized that grapes like a certain kind of neighborhood. But it was a reach to plant Pinot. And it was only years later that we discovered how good of a site and how perfect of a site we had for those grapes.
Did you have much of an agricultural background?
No, I had none. So I in the beginning I hired Lonnie to be my consultant as far as planting, and then I took advantage of the Oregon Wine Growers Association. They always are running seminars, and so they had seminars on, my timing was good because there was now the second wave of wineries was coming in. So they had the original founding families of 6 or whatever in the Willamette Valley, and now everybody was going through the same questions. They weren't sure about what sort of trellising. They weren't sure what sort of plant material was best. They weren't sure about cropping levels and all those things. And so we had constant seminars, and I would sign up for those. And so I was learning, and then I had Lonnie to fall back on. But after a couple of years, I decided I had to cut the strings from Lonnie and make my own mistakes, or else I would be a very passive participant in this. And so, I let Lonnie loose as a consultant and decided, at least on the grape growing end, I was going to try to do it as much as I could myself. With a little help from extension service and books but just at that time it was just the experience of actually getting out there in the field, Now it wasn't long before I acquired a foreman, but that was 3-4 years down the road when I already had 10 acres of grapes and I was doing all the pruning and so I was learning. But then Ian Arrow, Magana, my foreman, I got introduced to probably in that 3rd, 4th year, and he was recent to the valley, had brothers and sisters here, but a mutual friend thought this guy has all the potential to be a real foreman. And so he was just working, on the crew up there, but he sent him down to see me, and we talked, and he hadn't really had any exposure to grapes, so I taught him the little bit I knew. He started working for me, and now it's been 20 years we've been together, and so he teaches me things about what's going on with the plants, and he's the guy that's really out in the field and completing, doing the sprays and stuff. I'm focused on the business end as this thing has grown.
What did your family think of this wine venture?
Well, I'm now a single man, so that answers part of that. It's not an easy. I think they thought being on the vineyard was cool for a lot of different reasons. We get good amount of snow here in these hills, so the winters can be fun, but they can also be isolating because we get enough snow that you may be shut out. But it's land in which you can have some goats, and so my kids were raised with some farm animals around and constant seeing deer and elk and all the other animals. So that's way cool. So I think they like that, and I think my wife just kind of tolerated that. This little 3-acre vineyard, you could kind of figure out how much that was going to cost. But then every time, you got a little bit more cash, you planted a little bit more, or you got a nicer piece of equipment, or another mower or something. So there's a lot of capital outlay, and that puts a stress into a relationship, undoubtedly. However, I think now, looking back, it's like, man, you said you were going to do this, and you did it. So by the time I had acquired this place, we still had ties to Chicago. So we went back to Chicago, and I told the people back there, I've acquired this 60-acre place, and now my dream was already larger. I'm going to plant this, and maybe someday we'll make wine, and these things. And I've had some of those people come here since then. They said, wow, you did exactly what you said you were going to, way back. So it's nice now, but it hasn't always been an easy road.
You spoke a little bit about when you got started in the 80s. There was maybe 6 wineries in the Willamette Valley, a couple wineries out here. Since then, how have you seen the wine industry evolve in this area?
Well, in the Gorge, back when there was the 4 or 5, 6 wineries, and a lot of other people had been in the business for a number of years, and they were really kind of tickled and happy to see a few of us come in who said, well, we want to get into the wine business somehow, because they had their wineries. They were growing some grapes, but they were always saying, someday this area is really going to take off, And I mean, the dreams went on. Chuck Henderson across the river, he planted in the early 70s, and so the dream really had existed for some time. They were waiting for everybody else to follow, and so there was that acceptance, and it was fun. And so even when the Blanchetts and Bill Swain and Charlie Hooper and Lonnie Wright and Chuck Henderson came also, and then a few of us new people were there. They were all excited that at any moment now, it's going to take off. Mm-hmm. But still, it didn't. It took a good 10 years after that time frame. A few more players came in, and we started selling our grapes. In the beginning, I sold my grapes to King Estate, and then to the Ponzis, and then Chenin. But I wasn't selling it to local wineries. I was selling it to wineries outside of this area. And it took longer time before, well, first of all, we started our production, and the other new wineries came in. That was a good 10 years or so. And I think one of the things that helped the most was the formation of the AVA, because it now gave recognition to this region. And it was intuitive back then that as a region, we had a challenge because we were clearly by state. We had vineyards and wineries on both sides. We had more kind of critical mass if we all joined together. We had easier time of marketing certain types of varietals as a Columbia Gorge appellation than we would as either Oregon or as Washington. A Washington producer in the Gorge trying to produce Pinot Noir has a hard time getting market recognition. But Columbia Gorge has developed a good reputation for Pinot, and so it makes it easier for someone on the Washington side. And I guess vice versa, you could say the thing with us. We produce a little bit of Merlot every few years. Nothing we grow here, but we acquire from the Columbia Gorge. If we were trying to market it as Oregon Merlot, it probably wouldn't have as much recognition as we can by Columbia Gorge. So then we started seeing, after that 10 years or so, we started seeing people actually kind of migrate into here with the dream of being in the wine and such.
Do you recall who some of the people or the forces behind creating the Columbia AVA?
Well, in the beginning, Charlie Hooper was into it. Cliff Blanchett had been into it, but he had just sold his winery to Bernie Lurch, who bought Hood River Vineyards. So Bernie and Charlie, Chuck Henderson came, but Chuck was a curmudgeon even in his late 80s, so he was, or 70s, he was there and supported it. I don't know, Bill, I don't know if you came to any of those gatherings when we were talking about doing the AVA thing in the...
I was gone.
Yeah, so Bill had left, but we had also the Hoopers sold their winery and it became Wind River Cellars. And so there was this original group that was talking about it. Then we decided, well, we're really going to take some action. And Joel Goodwillie, who had bought the Hooper family winery and renamed it Wind River, he was behind that. And we all decided that Bernie had come from, he had a PhD, and so therefore he could write, and so he was going to write the proposal. That languished kind of for a number of years. Prior to that, Chuck Henderson had actually written a proposal for the AVA himself, and so that was latched on to, and that was dusted off and was supposed to help bootstrap this, but nothing happened. So finally it was figured out that that group wasn't going to get it done, and a little bit more expanded group was formed, and as I understand it, Mark Wary, who has a vineyard on Underwood Mountain, was brought in to be the guy who would write the proposal. And we kind of formed a working group that was larger, and some people contributed some funds, and he ran the project. So that's how that came about.
Have you had much experience in the Wine Growers Association out here?
I had much more experience. We're always members, and I was the second president. So the first president was Joel Goodwillie's wife. Her name's escaping me. But she was the first president. Right after we formed the AVA, then we got a little bit more formal, and she did that. And one of the first things that we really had was a map. So we had a winery map that we could use for promotional purposes. Mm-hmm. And the group has grown in to have more concerns than just the map and more marketing. It's primarily a marketing organization. So I came about as the second president, and then we've continued to participate, whether on the marketing committee or as people from my company being on the board, or just general participation, because I think it really has been really important as far as unifying the area for a marketing presence. Now, both Oregon and Washington have their state associations, and those state associations are the people that actually have some funds and access to funds. So it has always been a challenge for our regional association to interface and try to grab some of that attention from the state organizations. The state organizations, whether it's the Washington Wine Commission or the Oregon Wine Board, have tax revenue. Mm-hmm. So they have larger income, and then they support education and marketing and different sort of programs like that. And I think they've done a real good job in recent years of bringing some of that, those resources from the state into the regional.
Excellent. I think I'm going to pause here because I think I would like to bring both of you together and talk about Phelps Creek Vineyards, your partnership, but also ask some more regional questions that I think getting both of your perspectives together would be valuable.
Sure. And Bill's real history all predates mine. So then, when you focus on Bill later on, you can get that earlier.
We'll definitely go back to the history part, for sure.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm Rachael Woody, and I'm here with Bill Swain and Bob Morus, and it's June 11th. We're at Phelps Creek Vineyards, and I'd like to start off talking about how you two formed your partnership, the evolution of Phelps Creek Vineyards, and then we'll get into some of the general regional and getting your thoughts on that.
Well, when I moved in to the area, or actually, I hadn't moved there. I was acquiring the property, and Bill had a winery called Three Rivers in town. So of those, there was 2 wineries on the Oregon side, and I think 3 at that time on the Washington side, and there was another kind of custom crush here on the Oregon side that went out on its own. So Bill had one of those operations, so I ended up stopping in his room and just started talking and picking his brain about the area. And I found out he had a passion, for the area, and had a lot of great information for me. And he was getting grapes from Lonnie Wright, as anybody who was making wine here was getting grapes from Lonnie. So he gave me Lonnie's name, and the Blanchetts up at Hood River Vineyards had said the same thing. In fact, the Blanchetts introduced me to my home builder, because he had just finished a house for them, and they wouldn't have used anybody else but that guy. So suddenly, just by reaching out to a few people that had been here for a while, you started making a network of kind of friends and advisors.
We also, there was before Bob arrived, we'd started a wine tasting group, which involved, of course, everybody who was in the wine business, which was a small group initially, but included, a lot of the local people that were, I guess you might want to say, more sophisticated in their tastes. And so, we had doctors and dentists and inn owners and lots of different people. So we would get together on a regular monthly basis and all get together and talk about different things. And going back in time, I remember one of our first group meetings was we were at Charlie Hooper's place over in Hewsome, and it was May 1980. And we were sitting out on his deck, and we were looking up at the sky and thinking, it's really weird. It's got this orange tinge to it. And we didn't find out until a couple hours later when we turned the TV on that was when Mount St. Helens had exploded. And we were looking at a whole bunch of ash coming over the top of us.
Yeah,
so,
it could have started falling on you guys. You were pretty, as the crow flies, you were pretty close to it.
Yeah, so it was, fortunately it all went, we got a little dusting of ash here, probably less than an eighth of an inch, and everything else got dumped elsewhere. But that was just kind of an interesting story that sort of ties in with our wine group here.
I think that that group just kept on growing and growing in size. And maybe it was Bill convinced Sherry Dobo to finally step in and kind of be the coordinator. At least she stepped in. So, because it had started out with all the wine professionals, but then it became their friends who were winos. And suddenly these gatherings, at least during the summer, sometimes approached 200 people. I mean, it was a lot of people at these things. So they became a summer rotation. It was, I think, steak at Hood River Vineyards. It was smoked turkey here. I didn't have a winery. I just had a house with enough room. And then up at Hooper's, it was a salmon. And there might have been I don't know if there was a fourth one. But that was the rotation every summer. And they got to be these great parties of all the wine-interested people, going, and it just kept on growing for a while, till finally it became so much that we kind of gave it up, because it was just overwhelming. And also, people started becoming more serious about having their own wineries and their own events, and this was kind of an all-dominating sort of thing. And I think nobody was willing to put all the work in that Sherry did, and she finally had enough.
Yeah, it always takes a driving force to keep something like that going, where it wants to drift off in different directions and peters out. At least the initial good intentions of everything kind of diffuses with time. So maybe it's time to do another one, Bob.
Yeah, it might be. There might be that excitement to do it again. So a lot of people met each other. They networked in that particular group. And you might have been networking with other winery owners, or you were networking with the guy who ran the Les Schwab, or somebody at the chamber, or whatever. So it was just a way to make connections. It's still a very small community here. just even beyond wine. So it's not difficult, but that was a kind of a ready source of meeting people.
Do you think there's still potential for growth here?
Oh,
Some things
yeah.
we've heard from Willamette Valley is it's kind of hit its peak as far as land available and marketing space available.
I think yes, there's plenty of opportunity out here, because we're still looking for our second anchor tenant, as I think of it like a really developed mall. So we have Mary Hill on one end of this mall, and I'm looking for an anchor tenant on the west side, and I think that could happen. And what has happened right now is a lot of couples with passion, but maybe not a lot of wine background, have come into it. And we're just starting to see now the people who actually came here right from the beginning to make wine, and they have wine education. So they're Davis grads, or they're grads from the Washington program and such, and they come here specifically to make wine. And so that's a whole different, If you look at Oregon starting out, I think with the exception of David Lett, they were professionals, but they were really garage winemakers, and those original 6 people. But I think Lett is a Davis grad, is he not?
Yeah, a number in the Willamette Valley, a number of them were UC Davis trained people. Sometimes it was in viticulture, sometimes it was in the winemaking program.
Yeah, but in that original 6, the formal education was a little thin compared to the on the job, and that's how largely the Gorge started out. And the first real exception to that, I would say, is Bill, because here you had a Davis guy who came in, back there, and when dinosaurs still roamed the Columbia Gorge, and the Missoula floods were happening.
Oh my goodness.
And so now that was great. That's great validation. You have a person with the formal education that says, I think this is a great place for grapes, as opposed to the guy who says, well, all my neighbors are growing pears, I want to grow grapes, and I'll start making some wine,
Mm-hmm.
So.
Could either of you speak to, Hood River has been known for a long time, very much fruit agriculture. Was it an easy transition into grape growing and winemaking, or what did that look like?
Easy transition, interesting. I don't think the transition is almost ever easy any place that grapes have developed worldwide over time. If you look at European vineyards, the valuable lower ground that's easy to farm into row crops and whatever was always used for that. And then the stuff that was, what else? Well, what can we grow there? And can't plant wheat, can't plant corn, can't plant grain. Oh, maybe grapes will grow. And, that's how Burgundy, that's how Bordeaux, and that's how other places kind of develop. This is the best thing we can grow here. And they turned out to be the perfect choice. And I think that will probably bear out here also over time. I can see how in the Napa Valley, walnuts and other crops were pulled out and planted with grapes there, as the Napa Valley just became such a valuable commodity for the land in the area. And that might happen here eventually, but there's a lot of land here that hasn't been used, or it hasn't been used for anything other than maybe growing wood. So we'll see how much of that transitions in the future. That's a long ways away, and we haven't reached, despite my complete satisfaction that I think this is still a better growing area than the Willamette Valley for Pinot Noir or Chardonnay or just about anything that they grow. We haven't reached the recognition of that, partly because we don't have enough people doing the high quality product that we're capable of, and partly because when places start to develop and start to gain a reputation, they have enough inertia and gravity behind the whole thing that it kind of carries the things along for a long period of time. But grapes are a long-term project. I mean, they've been growing grapes in areas of Europe for 1,000 years or more, and we've been doing it here for 30 or something
30
like
years,
that.
yeah.
So I mean, we're just like we're toddlers in the whole wine scene if you look at it from the broad perspective of time.
So coming into an area that already has agriculture, I mean, Hood River Valley is 75% planted to pears. The reputation is for apples. That dates to the 1920s and prior. But they had a big freeze back then, and pears are a little more hardy. So this valley transformed into but you can see how that inertia for reputation will continue. If you come into an area that's already ag, there's some ag stores. There's a tractor dealer. There's, you can get farm diesel. And so you can get some. You might not get exactly the grape things that you need, but you can get a lot of that equipment, and a lot of it's the same. So that was an advantage. Now, grapes in Oregon tend to be grown on secondary, less desirable lands. Not so much, I think, that because they're more desirable for grapes. We want slope. Why? Because we're growing on the edge. We're trying to grow in a marginal climate to where our season, the grapes take the entire available season from the last killing frost to the first killing frost of fall. We take up that season. We get the most hang time. But then we want to give us the most advantage we can. So if we're on a steeper slope, we gather more sun. And if we're on a steep slope, we have frost protection, and we're growing grapes that don't require ladders. So for all those reasons, the land that's not really suitable for orchards also happens to be the best for vineyards. Oh, and lastly, the land on the hillside tends to be less rich. So if you have an orchard, you want to have vigorous land because it's about the tonnage that you can bring off. With grapes, it's purely the quality. So if we can have more lean soil, we think we can have better grapes. So all those reasons put vineyards in Oregon on a hillside. And so that has worked out to be pretty synergistic. So, and I've found that the farming community here has embraced it because their problem is they don't want to see change and lose ag. They want to be able to keep their orchards. And when they see people coming in bringing more economic vitality, but it's agricultural related, they've been pretty supportive of that. Now, when it takes over and it's all grapes, that could be a different dynamic. But we're such a long ways away from that time.
Yeah, who knows where we'll be 100 years from now, but or whatever that's going to be, we're at the very beginning of it.
In being in this area for the time that you both have been, what have you found being the best varietals for this area? And then speaking to the larger Columbia area, because the different sides of the gorge, the different slopes, I imagine there's a tremendous amount of variety.
There's a tremendous amount of varietal difference. Grapes like a particular neighborhood. So right where we're seated right now, we are the westernmost vineyard on the Oregon side of this appellation. And its heat units and its rain all drive us towards cool weather varietals like Pinot Noir and Chardonnay. But it's that difference goes from east to west. The same varietals are really prime north-south between Mount Hood and Mount Adams. You can also throw in Gewürztraminer and Pinot Gris and a little bit of Riesling. All the cool weather varietals are on that. Now, as we go to the east, we're going to start seeing Rhone varietals and Bordeaux varietals as far as ways the Dalles 20, 25 miles away. So a short distance, it's changing its climate. that gets a little muddled in the mind of the consumer, because a lot of the original wineries here had a real Bordeaux focus. They weren't growing that many grapes themselves. They were bringing in most of their grapes. The vineyards that existed were to the east, not very far, could have been 15, 20 miles, but they grew warmer varietals. So you'll see a focus still in the Hood River Valley of people selling, marketing in their tasting rooms, Cabs and Merlots and things that don't really grow in this valley.
Yeah, and when you're talking about grapes and climate and growing conditions, there's kind of a macroclimate and also microclimate considerations to take into account. In the Willamette Valley, you have a kind of this general macroclimate. You know, the temperatures and the rainfall are all within a kind of a range, but there's variations on elevation, whether you're to the north, you know, what your exposure is, whether you have a pure south or southeastern, southwestern, all those things make a difference. They're more subtle, but they make a difference, and the same is true here, but I think we have even more variables, because we certainly have much more up and down, much more extreme elevation changes that we can utilize to influence the varieties of grapes that we grow and the quality we get. And then also, as you get closer to the river, you get more wind. Wind can be a big factor in how a vineyard works. You can have the same amount of heat rays or sun rays coming down to the vineyard in this spot and another one that's closer to the river, and the wind is kind of blowing away the heat as it's coming down. It's not accumulating, so you can have even though your sensors may say it's the same, it's really not the same.
So you touched on this a little bit, but for this area, how do you market Columbia Gorge wine?
Well, when I'm there's not that many wineries in the gorge that have distribution beyond Oregon and Washington, but we're one of the few that do, and we have some international distribution. I lead off with talking about being an Oregon winery, and primarily because that has more recognition. That's getting market penetration now, and I can ride the coattails of some other people in some of those markets. But then when they're familiar with Oregon wines, then I can hit them with, well, we're Columbia Gorge. You know, you don't have any Columbia Gorge in your portfolio, you need to have that. So I am usually leading with Oregon. In terms of Columbia Gorge, 3 years ago, when I would say Columbia Gorge, they would nod their head, but then if they repeated it back to me or if they showed me where they had it on the shelf, it was always Columbia Valley. So that was very common. And then I would point out, well, you know, Columbia Valley is, we think of it as a Washington appellation, but actually has significant land in Oregon also. But we're Columbia Gorge, and they give me a chance to really tell them why this is different. But I have found now we're getting enough attention that's starting to fade. They're starting, the real wine people know. Now, you know, still the run-of-the-mill person would say, so you grow grapes in Oregon? They still don't know. But this end of the business of fine wine, we're talking such a small percentage of wine consumers. We're talking less than 1% of the wine consumers are the target market for all of Oregon's wine, basically, and all of my wines. It's a very small segment of someone who's buying wines that are $30 or more a bottle. That brings us, it's two-edged. It brings us a more narrow market, but it brings us people generally who are willing to buy that, more educated.
One thing that we found in Southern Oregon is that there was a focus more on selling to your neighbors, a more local marketing focus. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, when a winery is at a certain size, unless they are fortunate, and I'm talking here about at a small size, so 2,000-3,000 cases or less, which is what a lot of small wineries start off at, or even less. It may start at 500 cases and grow to 3,000, and that's their upper limit. But when you're at that size, you have to sell a high proportion of your wine not through distribution unless you can claim a certain almost cult-like status where people are really willing to pay extra just because of who you are. But if you haven't achieved that status, then you have to sell it to either local people, or if you're close enough to a freeway, you can sell it to people who pass by you traveling from one place to another. So small wineries that keep their head above water generally have good locations for selling to people that come to the winery directly.
I'd like to ask you guys about Washington and Oregon, the bi-state AVA. What are the strengths and challenges of having that as part of your geography?
I think the strength is a relatively small AVA gets more critical mass when it expands as geographically we do. So rather than having it be named two different things, being named one thing gives us some impact. The challenges always tend to be from the funding sources. So I'm on a standing committee of research for Oregon winemaking and viticultural research. And we just had the director of the Washington board meet with the Oregon one, and we're going to do some collaborative things. So the scientists and the professors are very willing to get together and share lab space and do some joint projects and publish together. The problem is when they seek the funding, it's very difficult to get the funding to flow across the state line, both ways. Oregon legislature doesn't want that funding to go to Washington, and Washington vice versa. So you have to finesse that to where you get them to accept that there's going to be some Oregon participation, but they're bringing their own funds to participate. So that's kind of a challenge. On a more local level, I mentioned before, we have this map of the district, of the tasting rooms in the district, and it goes on both sides of the river. Well, Klickitat County, which is a huge county in Washington, decided they were going to fund their own map, and so that wasn't going to talk about Oregon. And then because they were funding it, and what they wanted to do was, well, they knew the Gorge had something going on, but they have a lot of wineries and Horse Heaven Hills and the rest of Klickitat County, which is humongous county. And so they wanted to do a map that pulled all that into one. And so then you've put in marketing resources of trying to get the Washington wineries and the Oregon wineries to pass out this map that has us both. But if you're not careful, some of your members start going with an only Washington map. And here we have a little bit of the same. I'm on a map called the Fruit Loop, and it's just the Hood River Valley. And so that could have some resentment from some of the Washington guys. Hey, wait a minute, you're not even mentioning us. So you have to put an extra effort into kind of making sure that we all work together.
Winemaker, especially small winery founders, like a lot of small business owners, tend to be strong personality, maverick type people, and getting them to all agree on something is kind of like the proverbial herding cats thing. It's just, it can be really difficult to do.
Yeah.
But if you didn't have the interesting people, you wouldn't have the interesting wines, which over time I think is a more important benefit than having a bunch of wishy-washy people that agree on everything.
That's a good point. In your time in the industry, have you ever had one of those, oh gosh, if I had to do it over again, I would do this?
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
What would those be for you?
Well, see, I started out small and reasonable. So, you know, I was growing grapes and I was selling to King Estate and Ponzi and Shanann, and it was penciling out. And then decided we were gonna, you know, have some wine made in our name. And so it was just wine made by Peter Rosbach of Shanann, but had my label on it. And that penciled out. But then in 2007, I think in 2006 we opened the tasting room, and we needed more wine because we couldn't have just wine for a couple of weeks. So, and in 7 we decided to build out our own facility on somebody else's land, but we put in a winery, and we greatly ramped up production because, well, if I was paying a fixed cost for my winemaking and for my winery and certain things, then I could lower my unit costs by making more of it. So I greatly expanded. I made the great leap forward into what has become now known as the Great Recession. So I had a lot of wine coming on the market right at the time in which that price wine was getting beat up. And the distributors across the country were deciding not to bring in more wine. They were depleting inventories. They were worried about the future, and they started filling their warehouse with imported wines at really low cost. So,
and going out of business, some of them.
Going out of business. And I chose a lot of ones that I helped them. I mean, I didn't help them go out of business. I gave them some inventory. They went out of business, and I never got paid. So that was just a matter of timing, and you don't always have that crystal ball. So yes, if I was to do it all again, I could have charted a path to be the same place I am right now, but not have gone down some side roads that I took. But, you know, on the other hand, I'm really happy about where I am right now, and it's coming about, you know, and so I wasn't alone in that. There was a lot of people that were caught up about the timing.
From my point of view, well, I'm not by nature one of these look back with regret type of people. We came to the Gorge in '78 and left in 1993. And I guess if I have something I would do over again, we left for other than winemaking reasons, or other than it was family issues. And I can get into that later if you want. It's kind of interesting. But I did leave. I think, you know, if I had hung in here like Bob, who was just kind of starting at the time I was getting ready to leave, if I'd hung around and kept on going, I would have been part of this growth they've had here, and probably enjoyed that a lot. Not to saying I didn't enjoy what came next for me, but
I think Bill had quite a shock when he came back in the community and found out what I had grown to, because...
Well, not only that, but when I left here, there were, I think, 5 wineries.
Yeah.
And when I came back, there were 40 or 50, something like that, whatever we have now. So,
yeah. So it was just a dramatic change. And I still don't think we have that anchor tenant. When I say the anchor tenant, I mean the person that's so well capitalized that they build something really beautiful from the beginning. So most of us are small places, which is very charming. I mean, I relate more to those people that they're bootstrapping it from the beginning and with a lot of struggles. But I have this feeling we're going to have someone come in and recognize the area and buy some land, and next thing you know, this castle winery is being built. So.
Yeah, I mean, Oregon is kind of, I think it built its way in the Willamette Valley. I'm talking about Oregon, because they were the ones that have built the Oregon reputation mainly for Pinot Noir, maybe for Chardonnay and Pinot Gris also. I think that was a number of people that just kept doing well enough that they finally, you know, people couldn't deny them the notice that they deserved. But if you look at Washington State, That was it American Tobacco that, I think American Tobacco that started St. Michel and then Columbia Crest, and put the massive amount of money into production and then marketing, which put Washington on the map. And I'm sure Washington would not be anything close to what it is now if it didn't have that huge input from one significant source. So we're not looking to have St. Michel here, but Maryhill is, I think, 85,000 cases, which makes them, by California's standards, still a small winery. But by Northwest standards, they're a significant player.
Right.
So if we had something like that, or even half that, here in the Hood River or the early Columbia Gorge area, that would, I think, attract more people to everybody else and attract more attention to the area.
I mean, Oregon's going through a transition right now as we speak, that we have now the Jackson family coming in, and Louis Jadot is coming in, and we've had the Druins, and of course King Estate was organic
Jadot recently. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that suddenly you have them in the valley questioning, how is that going to play? Are these big dogs going to still play in the kennel with all of us relatively little dogs? The early signs are quite good. I was at a meeting and the Jackson family flew up for the meeting. Just to go to a reception, they flew up in their plane. So that was really, that was nice. And, it could easily happen here. This is the type of place in which people, not so much for wine, but for outdoor sports and things, decide they want to come here. And so it's going to be somebody who combines those things. Now, is that really a positive experience? I'm not sure, but it seems to me it's a milestone that is going to probably happen at some point. And it's nice, just because they will have the marketing resources to try to push their product across the country, so that helps bring recognition.
Yeah, it takes development. I started off in the Napa Valley back in the early 70s. When I first started working there in the Napa Valley, there was more Chenin Blanc planted than there was Cabernet Sauvignon. So that gives you an idea of what that local industry was like then, and I don't think you could find maybe you could find one or two Chenin Blanc vines, but if you're not Merlot or Chardonnay or Cabernet Sauvignon or some of the other, more significant red varietals, you probably can't sell your grapes there, but you can sell the others for quite a bit of money. So there's a huge transition there over 40 years. So.
The media attention has gotten to be very encouraging. So starting in 2006, Parker's Wine Advocate covered this area as part of its review of Oregon Pinots. And then also on the Washington side, some of the growers were included in the Washington review. So that's very positive, and they kind of had, the Advocate had changed it from a review of Willamette Valley Pinots to now they call it a review of Oregon wines. So that expands and gets that out. John Bonet of the San Francisco Chronicle just in the last month wrote a beautiful article about basically saying the Columbia Gorge was this hidden gem ready to, it needs a lot more attention than it was getting. And we were mentioned in it, but I was really impressed about who he mentioned, because he mentioned other people who are relatively new that came in just to make wine. So that was to me, I don't know how he connected with those people, but it was a very encouraging article because it was, for the first time, somebody from out of the area really giving broad attention to this, and pictures and the whole thing. So I think it's going to get that additional attention. And I also say is that the Oregon Wine Board, who does the marketing on the Oregon side, really does reach out to us now. They've been doing that for the last 4 or 5 years, and Oregon has a couple of big events coming up. They have Oregon Pinot Camp coming up in July. at the end of Pinot Camp, 14 of the visitors from international visitors are going to go to a dinner, and we're going to be one of the 5 wineries there. And then there's the IPNC. And again, state funds through the Oregon Wine Board bring in some foreign visitors to the IPNC, and there's going to be a gathering the Sunday that ends, and Phelps Creek's going to be there. So I'm really pleased that, you know, there's been a reach out to make sure that, in fact, I think that IPNC dinner is going to be all gorge. So it's going to be a gorged focused dinner, but at a Portland restaurant, because those people are flying out. And so that's great, you know.
All right. Well, are there any questions that I should have asked you that I haven't yet, or any stories that you two would like to tell before we move on to Bill?
Maybe a quick rundown on kind of the history of the winery development in the gorge, more clearly define that. Charles Chuck Henderson came out here as a farmer, and he bought I think it was predominantly cherries. He may have had apples and pears also, but predominantly cherry orchard on the Washington side, just north of White Salmon. And he started dabbling with wine grapes mid to late 60s, as I recall. And he started working with Dr. Clore, Walter Clore from Washington State University, who had set off to do kind of a potential vineyard growing mapping thing of different parts of I guess Washington, but I think it bled over to the border areas also. And he was probably the first academic type to say, yes, the gorge has a lot of potential. And as a matter of fact, one of the reasons I even came here to look at stuff is because I had read some work that he had done. And so that was what I think initially attracted me to investigate this area. So Chuck Henderson was certainly the pioneer. His first plantings were, what I'm guessing, early, mid-70s.
So he was sniffing around the same time David Lett was putting some sticks into the ground. You know, it goes back to that time frame. There is even, you know, pre-recorded history when the pines vines were put in by Pisano's. Rumor is that the guys who were doing the masonry work for the Columbia Gorge Highway, the old highway, so there was Zinfandel planted over 100 years ago in this area. But that was isolated and probably mostly grew from the Italians that were there wanting to get access to their own grapes.
And
you know.
The locals call Bingen, I still prefer to call Bingen, which is the German name after it was named. That was settled because of the name, you know, predominantly German people in the probably late 1800s, and they did plant some vines, and there's some evidence of that. So there's some early history of trying to grow, just like there is at most agricultural places. You know, a lot of people are trying a lot of different things, and wine has always been an important part of the old world culture, so why wouldn't they try that? There was evidence of that. And then so Chuck, I came up here in 1978, and he had wines in the bottle for a while, so I'm guessing his first bottling was probably mid-70s, I'm guessing. Must have been, maybe 75. And so when I came up here and met Chuck, he was very helpful, and he actually helped me find the property across the river in Underwood that I bought and planted the grapes. About the same time that I was sniffing around here, that's when Cliff Blanchette was already getting ready to start planting grapes. So he had grapes in the ground before I did, and I think his first harvest was maybe 81, Sounds about right. Mine was in '83. I think Charlie Hooper's at Hooper Family Winery was probably '85. And then there was a little bit of a lull before.
And then when did Cushman put his vineyard?
Oh, that's right. His was in there. Well, we started the winery in '83, so he probably planted that around 1980, I'm guessing.
So one fellow that we hadn't talked about, Rich Cushman, another Davis grad who grew up in the Hood River Valley, and he ended up planting a vineyard here in that time frame Bill was talking about, but he plied his trade always in the Willamette Valley. So he lived in McMinnville and worked for a number of different wineries, and then in 2006 moved back to live here and became my winemaker in at least for half of my wines in 2006. In 2007 he was really in charge of the total production, but moving back to here. So there were some roots. There was early vineyards, there was some interest, but they weren't always here. Then as we look at the development of this area, part of the recognition, I think, was when people started buying grapes from the Willamette Valley and they came out here to buy grapes. So once we were into production in about 95, 96, we were selling grapes to King Estate. And King Estate had planted about 1990, but they weren't in full production. So Brad Beal, who was the vineyard manager, would come up here and he was sourcing grapes from Lonnie, and Lonnie was putting him in touch with other people that had grapes. And so they were excited to get from Lonnie. I mean, they were getting Bordeaux varietals that they were just playing around with down in their winery in Eugene. And then Brad started getting grapes from us. Well, that was really important because King Estate they're an anchor tenant, and they paid on time. So when you had new vineyards coming into production and they were excited about your place, they paid you in 10 days from harvest. I mean, it suddenly made the business more sustainable. And that went on for a number of years, but they would talk about getting the grapes from out here, and then that led to like the Ponzi's. They were looking for more grapes, and they drove out here and they were buying some grapes. And then Peter Rosbeck of Cheyenne had fallen in love with the fruit, starting with the Zinfandel and then the Dow's, and then he started looking around to the other vineyards. And so all that action brought some attention. 10 years ago, if you asked people in the Willamette Valley about what's going on in Hood River, they had no idea, even if they were in the wine industry. Now, you ask any of those guys, they know it's pretty vibrant out here. And some of them have even been here. So they still are a little provincial, but a lot of them have been in here. And in fact, if you really get talking to some of these guys, they'll say, well, I looked at the Hood River Valley back then in the late 80s. I was looking there, but there was just a few more wineries in the Willamette Valley, so I went there. So Harry Peterson Nedry of Chehalem has told me that story, and others have said, we thought about it.
They'll rue the day that they didn't.
Yes.
Someday. So, we didn't even talk much about Celilo over there. Dr. McAndrews, who's probably had the first planting of grapes that started showing up on labels at other wineries, is because it made good enough wine that it was worth doing that principally with his Gewürztraminer, but also his Chardonnay and Pinot Noir that James Mantone's making at Syncline created some waves also.
So when was that planted?
It must be, it was well established when I got here, so maybe 75. I don't know. We need to call Rick up and ask him.
Yeah. So the doc, as Rick would say, the doc acquired a whole bunch of land and had it planted to a lot of pears I don't know if they have any apples, but they have pears. And then he wanted some grapes. And then the grapes were successful, so they planted more grapes to where that's a really acclaimed vineyard. In fact, in the story of Northwest Chardonnay, it's a very important site because when I came in, if we go back, say 1990, Chardonnay, they were throwing their hands up because they were not having luck getting Chardonnay ripe season after season. And so Oregon had planted Chardonnay because, well, in France, Chardonnay and Pinot Noir, they should go hand in hand. And the Pinots were coming into their own, but the Chardonnay was always more difficult. And I started attending these seminars, and it was about plant selection. And they're saying, you know what? We planted the wrong clone of Chardonnay. And we know Chardonnay can grow here great because if we look at two wineries, Ken Wright Cellars, but I think they were actually looking at him when he was at Panther Creek. He does a Celilo Chardonnay. And Rick Small of Woodward Canyon does a Celilo Chardonnay. Well, where's this Celilo? It's on Underwood Mountain. That's even cooler than the Willamette Valley. It's just north of me, but it's a cooler, wetter site than here. And so that triggered, it was a clonal issue. They just had the wrong Chardonnay planted. And heck, we weren't even all that aware of clones prior to that. So they started doing, importing these Dijon clones and doing tests with these Wente clones. And next thing you know, I was attending seminars where the wines were being made at OSU, and they were just, the only difference was the clone, and we were isolating what might work, and we started planting new plant material. And now Chardonnay is doing great in Oregon. And that all comes from that, and Celilo has a lot to do with it because they changed people's minds.
Do you have a feel for where most of the grapes in the gorge are planted? It seems like there's more in Underwood than maybe any place.
Yeah, I would say Underwood is really...
I mean, it's the easiest to find and plant a potential vineyard area that has a nice southern exposure, just because of the way it is. It's
how
on
the
that
mountain
side
is,
of the
yeah.
river.
The rest of the Hood River Valley, people have driven up and said, well, where the heck are your grapes? Because we're all tucked back here in the hills. So we're not on the flat land and the road. Mm-hmm. Now, I would love to have a few vineyards be right on Country Club Road. And I got some sites where I would just love for that because it would tell everybody you're in a wine district. But they probably, realistically, wouldn't be the best grapes that winery had, but they would be the showiest ones, So that would help. But yeah, we're tucked up here. So we have 30 acres here, and Wyest has 30 acres tucked up, and you wouldn't know where it was unless you got there.
You gotta look for it.
Yeah, and
you have to know where it is, and then
Abel
make it a
has
destination.
Mount Hood Winery. Now they have grapes right there on the highway, but they also suffer from winter frost because they're a little flat. So, but it really adds to the perception you're in a wine district.
All right. Shall we take a break?
Sure.
All right. Thank you both.